The proletariat originated in the Industrial Revolution, which took place in England in the last half of the last century, and which has since then been repeated in all the civilized countries of the world. This Industrial Revolution was precipitated by the discovery of the steam engine, various spinning machines, the mechanical loom, and a whole series of other mechanical devices. These machines, which were very expensive and hence could be bought but only by big capitalists, altered the whole mode of production and displaced the farmer workers, because the machines turned out cheaper and better commodities than the workers could produce with their inefficient spinning wheels and hand looms. The machines delivered industry wholly into the hands of the big capitalists and rendered entirely worthless the meager property of the workers. The result was that capitalists soon had everything in their hands and nothing remained to the workers. This marked the introduction of the factory system into the textile industry. Once the impulse to the introduction of machinery and the factory system had been given, the system spread quickly to all other branches of industry, especially cloth and book printing, pottery, and the metal industries. Labor was more and more divided among the individual workers, so that the worker who previously had done a complete piece of work now did only a part of that piece. This division of labor made it possible to produce things faster and cheaper. It reduced the activity of the individual worker to simple, endlessly repeated mechanical motions, which could be performed not only as well, but much better by a machine. In this way, all these industries fell, one after another, under the dominance of steam, machinery, and the factory system, just as spinning and weaving had already done. But at the same time, they also fell into the hands of big capitalists, and their workers were deprived of whatever independence remained to them. Gradually, not only genuine manufacturers, but also handicrafts came within the province of the factory system, as big capitalists increasingly displaced the smaller master craftsmen by setting up huge workshops, which saved many expenses and permitted an elaborate division of labor. This is how it has come about that in civilized countries, at the present time, nearly all kinds of labor are performed in factories, and in nearly all branches of work, handicrafts and manufacture have been superseded. This process has, to an ever greater degree, ruined the old middle class, especially the small handicraftsmen. It has entirely transformed the condition of the workers, and two new classes have been created, which are gradually swallowing up all the others. These are the class of the big capitalists, who in all civilized countries are already in almost exclusive possession of the means of subsistence and of the instruments and materials necessary for the production of the means of subsistence. This is the bourgeois class, or the bourgeoisie, the class of the wholly propertyless, who are obliged to sell their labor to the bourgeoisie in order to get in exchange the means of subsistence for their support. This is the class of the proletarians, or the proletariat. As a common trend throughout the work, we see the universality talk is brought up again. Of course, that of the proletariat here, yet now Engels' book truly begins here. And what I mean here is one thing. He's done describing actual abstractions and moves on to make them concrete, which, by approaching the concrete, makes the abstraction more graspable and more distinct. And what is made more distinct is the working class under capitalism from the preceding dialectical stages of other working classes. So, how does Engels, and later Marx, does it? Quite simple, actually. He states the birthplace of this universal stage of the working class, the fact that it has since then replicated itself since its inception, and what material conditions allowed for its birth and replication, which, at this point, one can connect the birth scene and the replication scene of this universal proletariat to the Industrial Revolution. Yet, we must never forget that the universal whence approached by contingencies of any region gets particularized, becomes more effective and dialectically developed by its particulars. But never forget that particulars are still part of this work, despite it appearing to be overshadowed by universals, which that perception understanding, being sensuous common sense, when I say perception understanding, will shatter pretty quickly if it hasn't already in the last 3 sections here. But let's move on. Now this section of replication and capitalism brings out the ruling class that the spirit, essence of capital will rely on, but has full authority to dictate. That class is the bourgeoisie, or better known as the bourgeois class, or, as we call it nowadays, capitalists. Already Engels builds up to the definition of the bourgeoisie without outright stating what the bourgeoisie is. He does it by connecting the Industrial Revolution with the bourgeoisie themselves. Talks of the Industrial Revolution starts with preludes of machinery being developed before the Industrial Revolution, which then is acquired by the bourgeoisie themselves, and is owned by such, and is worked on in the buildings that stores the machinery, and those buildings are called factories. Yet, they aren't worked by the bourgeoisie, but by another class, the working class of society. It is the proletariat themselves. And as a due result of the Industrial Revolution being a core contingency of the march of history, being which the Industrial Revolution has succeeded in its own rights, and set the dialectic into motion even faster, it would have major ramifications of society, as capitalism as a universal would particularize for itself as to reproduce itself while rooting out the previous social orders it had manifested itself into. Of the major consequences of the universality of capitalism starting its particularization, and in the meanwhile rooting out the useless remains of the mercantile feudal epoch, there are many. The 2 big ones being the proletariat, being the unique stage of the history of the working class to fully be deprived of the means of production, and then the bourgeoisie to be the unique stage of the history of the ruling class of society, mind you, to fully centralize the means of production to themselves in it for itself. Private property under the universality of capitalism is one of the many antagonistic contradictions which, mind you, was a consequence of the Industrial Revolution that will define the relationship between the 2 classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It will also define their class characters, and in the meanwhile define their class interests. Yet, what is private property? Private property is twofold. It, in itself, is a universal trait of the means of production that private property dialectically came to be such under capitalism, and, for itself, remains a qualifier in the march of history, mind you, that determines the class character of the means of production. Why the distinction between private property and the means of production? Well, it's no coincidence that the twins of dialectical materialism is historical materialism and contingencies. Yet, a talk for another time for that subject. Let's get back to the original question and actually answer it with the due respect it deserves. The distinction lies with the active opposition between the in itself and the for itself that gets incorporated later in the in it for itself. In itself, as used by Hegel and implicitly by all dialecticians thereafter, is a signifier for what the thing is in its qualities and the contingencies that stock it. Going back to private property, it possesses in itself as a universal trait of the means of production under capitalism. For itself, however, it is a signifier of how the thing understands itself. For private property under the dictum of capital, we'll see that it helps makes the distinction of the current means of production with the other previous means of production under previous social orders, and dialectically qualifies the means of production under capitalism as the only unique possession under the ruling class itself. Which leads us to understand private property in and for itself as the capitalist class character of the means of production, and this ties back to the bourgeoisie, since the bourgeois class relies on this for their survival of their existence as a class, and at the same time also helps it spread itself across the globe and the other industries as well. And we'll see later in the section why this class character really matters. As we see, without this particular class character, private property, we wouldn't get to see the distinctions between the working and ruling classes of society, and not be able to understand the antagonistic contradictions between the two. Yet, let's focus on the symptoms caused by this antagonistic contradiction: alienations and the division of labor. Private property, in and for itself, as a capitalist class character of the means of production, will define and shape the entirety of how the means of production operates and relates to the working and ruling classes. One of them, including the ownership aspect of each class, is the division of labor of the proletariat. For the capitalist, it allows the capitalist to hire laborers to work monotonously on one part of the commodity, and commodity is just a term for product, mind you, and not worry about trading other skills necessary to create the entire commodity. For the proletariat, it works as one of the many forces contributing to what Marx would call alienation. And while this is an implicit reading that is scantily referenced here, mind you, it deserves to at least be humored at this point of time, since it was brought up by me, of course. And it deserves this attention early on in this work because it will bring and shed light to other concepts that Marx will later bring on, and it will make it understandable why he brings it up and what they actually mean as Marx brings them up. Alienation, as Marxists would use it, has four main distinctions, which all four of them play off each other, just like how predicates in an argument play off each other, and just like how particulars in a universal play off each other. The four types of alienations, as used by Marxists, are alienation of production, alienation of other, and the alienation of other that I'm talking about is the alienation of lowercase o other. I'll get to that in a bit. There's also alienation of oneself and alienation of species being. Now I say alienation of lowercase o other instead of just saying alienation of other flat out is because lowercase o other is quite different from uppercase o other. Lowercase o other is anybody that you can think of right now. It could be your neighbor, your friend, your best friend, your couple, your father and mother, your siblings, whoever. That's another person, another object, another thing. These are all tangible, actual things. It doesn't make the uppercase O other intangible, unreal, but for the uppercase O other, it's something like as of the law, society, language, uppercase G God, the Absolute, or the Big Other, as Zizek likes to use a lot, actually. This distinction between lowercase and uppercase O other has to be made early on by Marxist teaching. People that are fresh into Marxism are starting to learn about Marxism in a theoretical sense. Even though people should be learning about Marxism in a theoretical and practical sense all the time, theory and praxis are different. But let's get back onto track with the 4 types of alienation right now. Alienation of production is what it sounds like. That the pro feels dissatisfied with their labor as is and can't see themselves in the commodity, the product, as I mentioned earlier, they created right in front of their own face. As evidently pointed out earlier in this analysis, the division of labor and its chief origin, private property, causes the psychosociological conditions of feeling alienated from one's own labor and humoring the thoughts that they have no worth in society. Which this alienation of production, is wholly unique under the capitalist social order, since it hasn't been seen in any other social order, including the mercantile feudal social order, mind you, where the entirety or majority of the working classes feels this alienation all at the same time. Again, I'm referencing the universal alienation of production. Yes, on a particular level, it's going to affect people differently, but universally, we all feel this alienation of production when we labor to create a commodity. This alienation, however, does collapse, and it collapses at the sight or presence of agitation for wanting to control the means of production, and then layer on owning such for which they, the proletariat, can feel like they are what they labor for. That they can labor and feel represented in the commodity. This is how the alienation dissipates. It's gotten rid of, and we no longer feel this alienation and no longer feel the consequences of this alienation as such. Alienation from others is also what it sounds like, being estranged from the lowercase o other. Oftentimes, this is presented by the bourgeois media as under the false image of competition between or amongst workers, and all the other false images that are related to such. But these false images distort and hide the true image of what was already stated, that they're merely not only being estranged, but they're aggressive against to their other compatriots. What I really mean here is that the pro has lost a meaningful connection with another pro because of how monotonous the labor conditions are, because of how they can be fired on the spot and then easily replaced by other unemployed workers at a moment's notice, and how other workers compete on a thing, a commodity for example, and not cooperate to do something together, to work together, to see to it that this commodity can be done together. There is no such thing as teamwork. It's only individual effort that is maintained under a leader, or really a ruler, a manager. Yet this alienation from the lowercase o other, will collapse over time as well, but for different reasons. You see, this alienation particularly will collapse once the people start seeing each other's collective plight, start feeling the empathy that was driven out of them thanks to the alienation to other lowercase o others, and begin forming a union of proles to combat their horrible working conditions. But I'll get on the topic of unions later on in this work, and then also in other Marxist works as well. But I'm not gonna divert any more time onto unions. Just know for now that unions are one of the many strong particulars and strong solutions to combating alienation of lowercase o other. Alienation from self is more harder to understand than the previous two. This is more upon the fact that it's probably more abstract. Again, actual abstraction, not philosophical abstraction, than the previous two alienations, but is what ultimately comes out thanks to the preceding two alienations. Once the self can no longer connect with the lowercase o other and connect with their fruits of labor, those shall commence the collapse of self. For once that happens, they begin to see their interests, their personal interests, conflict with what they are doing to attain such, which leads to them fundamentally questioning their personal interests and starting to begin to develop their own particular class interests, which will be swayed and be a part of, all with the entire class interest, the universal class interests, and those proles that shares a common class interests and universal class interests will go forward to seek to attain such. Vis-a-vis, through the power and the energy of unions, through utilizing Soviets or consuls, or through the power of revolutions themselves. But more upon all three of them later, and more upon the other ways workers can do to attain their class interests without betraying their own class later on. Alienation from species being is what ultimately ties all of these in a Brahmian knot, and this alienation is probably the most abstract of the other alienations, but is still an actual abstraction. Once this alienation is achieved, the once being in it for itself, or the ideal I of the subjective I, collapses. Fundamentally, they see their purpose in life shattered right in front of them, and they face themselves a lack of words to describe their own crisis that they face in the current moment, or have been facing for a long time. And if you were ever in a philosophy class, you'll probably recognize the Lacanian verbiage I've been using this entire section, that being Brahmian knot, the subjective I, and the ideal I being one of the many things, also including the signifier as well, even though the signifier belongs more with semiotics. But that's just me merely pointing out that I'm using Lacanian verbiage, and that is not particularly actually Marxist verbiage. I want to point this out because I'm just pointing this out due to the fact that I don't want anybody to be confused, that you're seeing the in it for itself and the ideal I and subjective I being used in the same sentence. Getting back on track, however, now how is this alienation resolved by the worker? It is resolved as early as the first section of this work, actually. The answer? Communism. And while getting back to that philosophy class mentioned for one more time, this is a clear-cut case of Aristoteles building up to a definition, if one were to read his works closely, mind you. I'll explain building up to a definition if it isn't that clear later on, but getting back on track, actually. Once communism is achieved, once the proletariat has been superseded and liberated from the despotism of capitalism. They do not get alienated, estranged from their purpose of life and what they are doing in the moment. This, when communism is achieved, is a remedy for this alienation, but a remedy that works forever. But it has to be struggled through in the revolution when you're trying to practice towards communism. It is not given for free once you achieve communism. You have to earn it. You have to destroy capitalism, just like how capitalism destroyed the old mercantile feudal epoch. If you're not going to be dedicating yourself to the revolution, you cannot call yourself a communist. If you're seeking a real road to communism, you'll neither understand or receive the benefits of communism. So if you're going to dedicate your life to communism, you're going to have to do everything what's within your effort to achieve communism. Alienation is a hard thing. Every Marxist understands that, but can be also combated with everybody else. Alienation is a social thing. It's not an individual thing. That's what makes Marx very distinct from every other sociologist, whether they be inspired by Marx or not. But let's get on with the rest of the section. And getting back to this entire section, with the success of capital and capitalism in the world, it still has the job to supersede the old mercantile feudal base, a base as of economy, while assuring that its superstructure is equally superseded with capitalism's superstructure that will benefit its base. The pro and the bourgeoisie will ultimately become the favored classes under capital's wings, the rest being assimilated or converted into one of those following classes. Of course, as anybody can read history books, in the entirety of human life and human progress, you know that this supersession isn't a clean one, and many classes and subclasses will develop in the medium of class struggle and conflict between the old and the new classes that is forthcoming in capitalism's birth. To just name a few, we got the lumpen proletariat, which is basically the non-working proletariat that is extremely poor or in the poverty section. Then we got proletariat proper. Then we got the petty bourgeoisie, which must work in order to survive, but is starting to utilize capital for its own sake, and is able to generate capital for its own sake, and is starting to dialectically become more and more bourgeois over time, assuming the economy doesn't screw them over. And as they become more bourgeois, they become less of a pro, and their class interests start orientating around the bourgeois class interests, if it hasn't already been bourgeois since they became a petty bourgeois. However, the petty bourgeoisie is willing to work with the pro under the condition that they won't get screwed over immediately during a revolution, mind you, but during capitalism, they're willing to work and die for the bourgeoisie themselves, unless of course they've been screwed over royally by the bourgeoisie. However, with just how capital functions in general, you can never really tell when a petty bourgeoisie is going to either act for the proles or against the proles. They're like a wild card, essentially. Getting back on track. This is what ultimately, I would say, Engels has finally done with this section. He finally closes the section in a perfect bow. And that perfect bow is the finalized universalities of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat themselves. For which, up to this point in time and to this work, is the most concrete definitions we as the readers can grasp before we particularize them or make them more concrete in a specific direction takes contingencies as the universals themselves approaches their own contingencies of any region in order to actualize themselves. Finally, Engels stops building up the definitions for now and merely presents us a definition that incorporates the reasoning and evidence that the reader has faced so far. Now, we can transition to the other part of the universal that hasn't been talked about up to this point so far. That part of the universal being what it is not. So far, we have only bothered with what it was and how it was that way in order to become what it was. This other part of the universal has to be talked about because, again, going back to sections 1 to 3, the universal is what it is and what it is not. You have to state what it is not in order to close off the definition and to make it as concrete as possible. For any sake of the imagination, of course.